Welcome everyone. Good morning. We're really happy to have you with us, and we are looking forward to today's chat, which is about mapping our roles in a social change ecosystem, the one we all find ourselves in the middle of these days. So we're looking forward to learning more about how you see your roles, to talking more about ours as well. Our role right now is as co-facilitators of the Collective of Results and Evidence-Based Investments, or CORE. I'm Nicole Lezin.
And I'm Nicole Young.
And so we are the Nicoles. And we're glad to be with you today. We know that at this point, many of you who are on the call are well aware of CORE, but we just wanted to give a brief overview for those who are not, and for those who may be less familiar. So the Collective of Results and Evidence-Based Investments, or CORE, is both a funding model and a movement to achieve equitable health and well-being in our county using a collective impact approach. And by equitable health and well-being, we try to raise up the idea of equity at the center of CORE in both the mission and vision statements that you see here. And these were developed with input from many of you and hundreds of people in our county over the last couple of years through a variety of meetings that were not by Zoom. So we miss that contact, but we're still happy to have the opportunity to interact with all of you this way. Equity also surfaces in these 8 interconnected core conditions that also have equity at the center. And these are the opportunities for equitable health and well-being that we see in our county. Equity at the center also recognizes the role of policies, procedures, laws, ordinances, both in perpetuating inequities and changing the status quo. And that's a big part of what we'll be talking about today, the different roles that we all play in achieving equitable health and well-being and dismantling some of the obstacles to that have happened historically in our county and across the country. As we talk about social change and our different roles in achieving it, we often are entering a space that feels risky. We want to encourage you to treat this as a brave and inclusive space as opposed to the default system of being perhaps more hesitant to voice our opinions or to experience discomfort. So that means stepping up with our voice, stepping back to allow other voices to enter the conversation, becoming more comfortable with discomfort, taking risks with saying how we truly feel, being vulnerable with groups, welcoming multiple points of view because all of us know more than any one of us, speaking carefully from our own experience and avoiding the assumptions about others, listening fully and being present in the conversation, embracing our own curiosity for openness to new ideas, being very careful to assume good intent and think about the impact that our words have on others, and respecting the confidentiality of these sessions. Even though they're recorded, we encourage everyone to think about reporting out the message as opposed to the messenger. And these are just some things to think about as group agreements as we move into both our overall discussion and the breakout sessions that we can take these into. Can we agree to these? Are there any that you'd like to add in the chat? Great. So I'm realizing that I missed an opportunity for all of us to introduce ourselves in addition to the Nicole, so I apologize. But just feel free to add in the chat, as some of you are already doing, your name and organization. We've got, let's see, we've got a nice grouping from across the core conditions, across the county, and we're very happy to have you here. Got some familiar faces and some new faces, which it's a combination we always like to see. Welcome, everyone. So let me turn the discussion over to Nicole Young, who's going to review some of the materials that we shared with you earlier.
Great, thank you. And we've been thinking about offering something on this topic for a while, and it felt like this was a good time to do this, kind of following up on some of our more recent coffee chats and core conversations focused on racial equity and anti-racism, and just how, realizing how many of us are in different ways working on social change, social justice. And so this framework that we came across recently just felt like it spoke to us, and we have a feeling it will speak to many of you, and just provide another opportunity or way to talk about the way that we all are using our different roles and skills and relationships to achieve change and equity. So this framework, as we mentioned in the email, it was developed by someone named Deepa Iyer. I hope I'm saying her name right. Of Solidarity Is and the Building Movement Project. And so in our emails, and we'll include a link in the chat box in a moment, we included the link to the Building Movement Project website, which has a lot of good resources, things that we might weave into additional coffee chats in the future, because we feel like it's so relevant and useful. But this particular model and really talking about social change and roles as part of an ecosystem, I think really spoke to us because, as some of you may have heard us mention before, we're constantly working on defining core as more than just a grant process or a contracting process that the county and city of Santa Cruz adopted a few years ago. We're even trying to really define it broader than just this 20-member steering committee that we've been working with for the last few years, and really thinking about core as a broader movement that all of you are now part of anytime you participate in something like this. And so knowing that we all represent different networks and different initiatives, it seems really valuable to talk about how we collectively can really strengthen and work together as that ecosystem. And, as we have seen kind of just the diversity in participants in these coffee chats grow, like it made us really interested and curious to hear more about how you all see yourselves in that ecosystem of social change. And so we thought we'd spend a little bit of time kind of walking through this and having some discussion about it. And as always, then we'll see where that leads us. And again, just feeling like this really complements, again, what Nicole was describing in terms of what core is and the connections between all of those core conditions for health and well-being with equity at the center. So in the guide that we sent out with the email, I'm hoping everyone had a chance to review that before the coffee chat today. We'll try to cover enough of the key concepts from it, so if you didn't have a chance to review it and do some of that reflection beforehand, you'll hopefully be able to get the gist of it, but definitely encourage you to go back later and read through it and work through the questions on your own. But you'll see in the center of this graphic that lists all these different roles and how they're all connected to the center with these 4 values: equity, liberation, justice, and solidarity at the center. That's kind of the whole gist of this ecosystem. And so we wanted to start off just asking you to share in the chat box, which of those values resonate with you the most? And you can name one of them. You can say all of them if you want, or you could list or describe some of the current issues or movements or community crises that are calling you to action right now, whether it's the Black Lives Matter movement or racial equity in general or equity for immigrants or whatever that cause or issue is that really moves you to take action. I want to hear from you in the chat box. So I see several equity and justice, all of them because they're all so connected. Yes, Najib. Equity and liberation, particularly because of emphasis or work on children, youth, and family mental health and well-being. Some more equity and justice. Housing evictions as an issue. Inequity in education, especially now with distance learning as a particular issue, calling someone to action, yes. And health equity, so you're right, lots of kind of variations or aspects of equity or types of equity that we're aiming for. And all of them, Erin says, especially standing in solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities. So great, thank you for that. I think, it's just a nice way to start off kind of affirming that we are all here for a shared purpose, right? That these speak to us all in one way or another, and that's exactly why we're all here. And so some of you were asking about, are there shared definitions of these values? In the guide there, I don't think they actually go into much description in the guide, but I think they do in the Building Movement Project website. Some of these are concepts that we've gotten into further detail to try to develop some of those shared definitions in core coffee chats and conversations. I think for today, it's really like whatever those mean to you and speak to you. We welcome your thoughts about which ones resonate most with you. But now we'll move on and do a little bit of a recap about the different social change roles that are defined in this guide. Again, we'll do just a quick recap of these 10 roles. We're hoping that you had a chance to read them and reflect on them. I saw some of you mentioning in the chat which role you identify with the most, and so we'll have more of an opportunity to have you share some of that in a moment. But for now, just do a quick run through of these roles. So the first one being a weaver. So if you're a weaver, you're someone who feels that you can see the through lines of connectivity between people, places, organizations, ideas, and movements. If you're an experimenter, you're someone who likes to innovate and pioneer and invent, and that you take risks and course correct as needed based on what you learn from taking those risks. Whereas if you are a frontline responder, you address community crises by marshaling and organizing resources, networks, and messages. The visionary role is someone who imagines and generates our boldest possibilities and hopes and dreams and reminds us all of our direction. And a builder is someone who develops, organizes, and implements ideas, practices, people, and resources in service of a collective vision. A caregiver is someone who nurtures and nourishes the people around them by creating and sustaining a community of care, joy, and connection. Disruptor takes uncomfortable and risky actions to shake up the status quo, to raise awareness, and to build power. And a healer recognizes and tends to the generational and current traumas that are caused by oppressive systems, institutions, policies, and practices. A storyteller is someone who crafts and shares our community stories, cultures, experiences, histories, and possibilities through art, music, media, and movement. The last role is guide, someone who teaches, counsels, and advises using their gifts of well-earned discernment and wisdom. And so we recognize that, you might identify different roles or use different names for roles that you see yourself in. For the purpose of today, we'll focus on these 10 roles because we think they do a really good job of of naming some of the very common types of functions and roles and things that we all do in social change movements. And so we're curious at this point, we're going to do a little poll. What are the top 3 roles that you find yourself playing most frequently in your work? And by work, we mean, it could be volunteer work or grassroots organizing or formal or paid work that you do. And so you can select multiple roles. We're going to suggest that you think about your top 3. We'll give you a moment to answer these before we close the poll and share the results. So we can see a little bit over half of you have responded. So we'll give it another 15, 20 seconds or so. And then we'll see what kind of themes or patterns emerge. Okay, looks like most everyone has responded. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So we can see quite a few weavers, people that weave together people, ideas, and a lot of builders, which is kind of a similar role. And so that's not too surprising that those are, looks like the top 2 responses that were chosen. But we also have quite a few people saying that they see themselves as experimenters, trying new and different ideas. And interestingly, like I think the fewest number of responses for frontline responder, someone that responds to kind of the immediate crises, and disruptor, I think, is probably the next lowest one in terms of the number of responses. So I think that's interesting. And so we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what comes up for you as you think about the roles that you play for yourself, as well as when you think about others that you work with and who you consider in your network. And if you were to do this mapping for all the people that you interact with, like what does that show? So I'll stop sharing the results now and turn it back over to Nicole Lezin.
Thanks, Nicole. So what we're going to do next is talk about some of these roles with each other in the breakout sessions. So in a minute or so, Nicole Young will send us into breakout groups. You'll see an instruction like the visual here that allows you to join it. We'll be in there together for just over 17 minutes of discussion. So the first thing we'll ask you to do is to unmute yourself and turn your cameras on and say hello to the other people in your group. These will be self-facilitated, unlike the ones that we did before that had some more formal facilitation. So, but we have total confidence in all of you to have this discussion together and to be weavers. So think about the Brave Space agreements to bring into this discussion. We're going to structure it. I'm going to put the questions into the chat here so that we'll all have them. Oops. I don't seem to be wanting to do that. Okay, I'll work on that. So in the next slide, we'll explain some of the questions that we're going to be covering. And we will send you a timing reminder about 7 minutes in to let you know that there are 10 minutes remaining. And there's also a warning timer. You can track it when you're in the breakout session. It's sort of a countdown clock that will tell you how the time is elapsing. So after you do your introductions, you might want to do your name and affiliation and the roles that you just identified in the poll. But we really want you to spend about 7 minutes talking about the impact of those roles. How do they affect you physically, in terms of your energy, emotionally, spiritually? What is the effect on you? And who or what sustains you in playing those roles? And so keeping in mind some of the ways that those roles might be comfortable, and there might be some that we might want to stretch into, and just talk about that for a few minutes with each other. And when you get the timing message from Nicole that we're going to move into the next set of questions, we want you to talk about how those roles connect to 2 things: the privilege that you may bring to it. So that might be the part of your life where you have some advantages based on skin color, gender, socioeconomic status, and so forth, or the power that you bring to a situation. So these might be ways that you think about when these roles might imply that you're taking up more space or not enough space, how these roles might give you power, either formally or informally, or maybe some ways in which your power is limited. So just a reflection on some of the ways that those roles connect to privilege and power in your life. So we'll go into those, and then we'll have a debriefing right afterwards, where we'll hear from some of the ideas that came to you in the chat. So ready? Let me
just say that so when I open the breakout rooms, you'll actually have to click join to join the breakout room. So if you're someone that put an asterisk by your name showing that you either cannot or are opting out of the breakouts, just don't click join and you'll stay in this main room. If you stay in the main room and you actually want to have a little discussion in the main room, I'll be staying in the main room. We can do that. So it's almost like creating our own little breakout. So again, for those of you that put an asterisk by your name, just know that you can either stay on mute, or you can unmute yourself and talk with me if you want. So I am going to make sure we are all set, and here we go.
Okay,
For
see you.
opening.
So thanks for doing that and for coming back. Would any of you like to chime in the chat, or if you'd like to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can comment to the whole group if you'd rather. Any insights from that set of questions or aha moments? Anything that called out to you? Let's see, I don't see any hands raised yet. In the participants part of the participants window, you should have an option to raise your hand so that we can see you. There we go. Najib, would you like to unmute yourself and let us know some reflections on that moment?
Yeah, our group, we definitely had some really great wisdom and learning going on. So I'll just give some quick highlights. I think the one piece about impact of playing our roles, definitely there's a, energy and physically, it takes a lot out of us, whether it's in the role of storytelling or building, visionary. By the end of the day, we are tired. And so, that was kind of a good kind of theme. And then finding ways to sustain ourselves, whether it's, disconnecting after the fact or going on, these short vacations these days with COVID, as well as just understanding the role that we play. And no matter what small action that we take, that there's a positive impact on the children, youth, families, communities that we work with. And then the other highlight was really around kind of privilege and power. Each of us understanding, whether it's our skin color, whether we're lighter skins, even though we may be from communities of color, the lighter skin definitely plays a role in the privilege and the power that we bring into a room. Our a couple of us being men, and how that plays a role in the privilege that we have, and of course education as well, and just understanding what those are, being critically self-reflecting, and the fact that what privileges do I bring into a room, into a conversation, how do people react to it, and being okay with how people feel about it, and trying to make sure that we use it for positive and not negative. And then the last piece of that is just being okay around, or understanding how to be good allies. I think we have a lot of conversation around privilege and power and oppression, which is really important. I feel like we need a little more conversation around how do we be good allies, and what are the characteristics of being good ally, and how do we advocate and encourage allyship in the work that we do.
Thanks, Najib. Those are some really similar themes that were in our group as well, just trying to be more intentional and more aware of privilege and its gradations and the implications for that in different settings. So thanks for sharing those. Kaki, do you have a couple insights to add or some reflections from your group? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I thought the conversation was super interesting, and couple of thoughts from it were, one, that even with these 10 roles and all the different ways that we are understanding privilege, it often feels like we're still being pigeonholed, like this doesn't really talk about the complexity of our lives and the way our lives are so complex, and that it's sometimes uncomfortable to be, working with a certain title or a certain perception of power and privilege. One of the folks in our group talked about the challenge of being raised without much money, and therefore not having any of the privileges that economic status provide.
Mhm.
but being white, and so being assumed to have some of those privileges. So it's just, it's just a great lesson that, you can never assume anything, and it takes getting to know people and playing around with that uncomfortableness and how we move things forward with all of that.
Yeah, great points. It's always complicated. Things are not necessarily what they seem. Good to question assumptions and assume good intent, as the brave space reminds us. So thanks for those reminders. Does anyone else want to share some ideas from their group or add to what we've just heard? Either raise your hand or chime in the chat. I also want to remind people, if there are resources that you'd like to share with others through the chat, please feel free to provide a link, or we can send some things out after the chat as well. Catherine, I see your hand up. You want to unmute yourself and let us know what's on your mind, what your group talked about?
Unmute, always forget unmute. Yeah, we had a little bit of a conversation about labels, like all of these roles that, we've identified ourselves with, and even the roles of privilege and power. And I was talking about how I don't really even want to wear any of those labels. And I can't possibly say it as well as the person in our group who did. If she would like to step up, I don't want to put her on the spot and repeat what she said about our responsibility, the fact that, we're sort of given these labels, and it's how we wear them and how we show up. And I'd love to encourage her to say what she said, because that, I think, has been one of the wisest things I've heard in these conversations that I've had in the core chats, as well as some other work that I'm doing and my team is doing around equity and social justice and racial justice. So I'll stop there, but just
okay. Well, thanks for
learning how labels can be things we don't want, but things that we have to rise to the responsibility of accepting.
Great. Well, it sounds like you've captured a lot of that, and if that person would like to add more, please let us know. But meanwhile, Joy from Second Harvest said she'd like to add something. So go ahead, Joy, if you're ready. Unmute yourself.
Hi.
Let us know.
I just wanted to speak to the idea of, white privilege that has come up, and also allyship, and just an understanding of what I often hear is there's I guess a misunderstanding that there's an assumption around growing up in privilege, like, financial privilege. And it's not that. You could have, two people, a Black person and a white person, that grow up in very similar socioeconomic statuses, maybe going to the same school that maybe isn't as well funded, may also, struggle with food insecurity, could even be coming from the foster system, but as they grow and go into life, the opportunities that are afforded a person with white skin versus a person with Black skin, that's kind of where the divergence takes place. And so somebody with Black skin may, just not be able to get a job, for instance, because of the color of their skin. And that's just kind of a quick and dirty understanding about what it's not. And I understand that when white privilege is brought up, it can trigger, and people can become defensive and say, well, I didn't grow up in privilege. And I think that there's just that misunderstanding that I want to help make clear, because I know that, that people that don't identify as BIPOC, suffer loss, suffer, tragedy and suffer hardships as well. So it's not denying that. It's just alluding to the fact that there is an extra set of freedoms that come with having white skin that Black people don't have. So I hope that helps kind of explain that, if anybody had any question around that. And then when it comes to allyship, one of the other things I loved what I don't know who it was saying earlier. People have asked me, how do I be an ally? How do I be a better ally? But the other thing that we kind of talked about was the idea of amplification, being an amplifier. Mm-hmm. And because that's an action, right? Because to be an ally is a noun, and to be an amplifier is to actually take action. And really, they go hand in hand. And so listening to the experience, acknowledging the experience of the BIPOC person, and then asking, or taking that message and moving it, forward.
Great. Thank you, Joy. I know we have a couple other hands raised, so we'll encourage you to keep contributing those ideas in the chat. But to build on what Joy was just saying about the amplifier role and other roles, we really want to think about and have an opportunity for some individual reflection that we hope will be sparked by some of the discussions we've just been having in the group. So as always, we could continue with this for hours and hours, and we hope in other settings you have opportunities to do that these are stimuli for those conversations. But for now, we're going to transition away from the group work and to some individual reflection that Nicole Young will guide us through. So thanks everyone for the small group work, and those of you who shared your reflections just now. Keep them coming in the chat, and we'll move on to some time to think on our own.
Thanks, Nicole. And just want to say thank you for all those really insightful comments that everyone shared. And I know that there's so many more. If we had more time, there would be so many more that we could hear and talk about. And I think it's giving us a lot of ideas too about further conversations and formats to continue these discussions. Because I think all of you are so spot on in terms of sometimes these are names or roles or labels that we naturally identify with and we fully own and feel good about. Other times they feel like labels that are put upon us, whether or not we want it. And so all of that really just kind of leads to that question of, so what do we do with this, right? Whether we choose these or these are handed to us or assumed about us, there's still this reality of to create equity and liberation and justice and solidarity, that it requires many people, many heads, many hearts, many hands. And so how do we make the best of our own natural skill sets and roles, or the ones that we have to stretch and kind of build that muscle ourselves in terms of these different roles and relationships. And so we'd like you to actually think now about the people that you interact with regularly. You might consider them mentors, supporters, allies, colleagues. They could potentially even be people that you consider adversaries or people that are more challenging, because they are also part of the ecosystem. And think about what are the primary roles that they each play. And we're going to give you a few minutes just to think about that and jot down on a piece of paper, or if you have the guide with the map in front of you, write their names next to as many of those circles or roles as you can, and we'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And while you're doing that, I'll just say too that I know for myself, one of the reasons why I think this particular model and concept really spoke to me was that I know that I can often find myself feeling like, oh, I'm a weaver and I'm a builder. That like those are roles that feel really natural for me, and like those are the good roles. And that when I run into people that are disruptors or play a different role that feels very outside of my comfort zone or not within my, usual skill sets or ways of being, it can feel really uncomfortable. And sometimes sometimes I know I can fall into that trap of being like, oh, one role is better than another, or everybody should be like this. And this really has challenged me to think about, what are those different roles that I actually need to be actively seeking out, or finding people that where that comes as a natural strength and skill set for them, because that strengthens my ecosystem. So we encourage you to, as you think about and kind of do this individual exercise, mapping, putting names on on your map, think about not only the people that feel really similar to you, but maybe even really different from as well. So again, give you just another minute, and then we'll ask you to share what you notice about that. And then again, if you have the guide in front of you, if you printed it out in advance, there are a couple of questions on page 7 that we're going to use as our discussion questions. So if you'd like to, you can jot down some notes and share those, or just if you don't have it in front of you or didn't get a chance to answer those in advance, we'll just open it up for, again, if a couple people would like to unmute themselves to share their reflections, we'd love to hear that. And it also encourage you to share your thoughts in the chat box as well. So we want you to take a look at, or think about, the names that you identified or wrote down on your map next to the different roles, and just share with us what you noticed. Do you notice any particular patterns in terms of lots of people filling the same kind of role, a lot of variety, any gaps? When you think about who's in your social change ecosystem, what do you notice? And so I see a few hands that are raised. I'm not sure if those were left over from the last discussion. I see Felicia, you have your hand up. Did you want to say something about this?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was noticing that the people I just interact with a lot of people, but the people that I was thinking of, I at first was thinking of them more through the lens that I come to them. As a weaver builder, I might initiate contact with certain people, and so I thought, oh, maybe they're weaving because I'm weaving with them. But then if I really thought about it, they actually probably wouldn't identify themselves as weavers. They would probably identify themselves in a different role. And then in realizing that, oh, when I reach out to them, they kind of pass on their experimenter role to me, because that's how we are. So the roles really become intermingled when you're meeting with somebody who plays a different role. So it's, you might think of somebody in some way, but they could have a totally different perspective as far as the role that they want to be playing or intend to be playing in a given movement. And so being open to stepping into their shoes and to help them do the part that you're stepping up with is an interesting question on how they all come together.
I think it's a really interesting insight, Felicia, but just, I think that's probably, I would imagine others probably can relate. I know I certainly can, where we want to see ourselves mirrored, right, in other people. And so we might start off assuming or believing that they are very similar to us. And then it takes that kind of willingness to kind of pause our own thoughts and recognize and realize, oh, wait, no, they have a very different take or role, and how can our roles complement each other and amplify each other? It's a great insight. Anybody else? I see, Kaki, do you have your hand up again to talk about this exercise?
No, that was on the first round.
Okay. Would anybody else like to share something that you noticed or observed as you did your system mapping with everybody that you interact with? Other comments that you want to share in the chat? I see some other comments in the chat, kind of speaking to the last discussion we were having about privilege and labels. And Joy, I see your comment about thinking of it as an experience rather than a label. That's a nice way to think about it. Okay. Last call. Any other insights, observations? Robin's saying in the chat, she has an insight that sometimes people are in professional positions that do not match their innate role. Yeah, which that in itself can create that feeling of discomfort or feeling like you're constantly swimming upstream. It's a great one. Thanks for sharing that. Any others before we move on? So Najib is asking, saying, mapping is great exercise. Does this mean if we have gaps in roles, should we be looking to find those who can fill those gaps? Do we need all roles to get to the 4 goals of equity, liberation, justice, and solidarity? Great question. So I'm going to actually pose that to the group and ask, what do you all think? If you notice gaps in roles, what do you take from that? What do you think is an action step? Gabby's saying that it's very important in a group or organization that you have all the roles represented. And so that might mean, especially if you're thinking about paid staffing positions, right? That it might change the way you think about recruitment, retention, so that you're thinking about, you know, what roles or experiences or perspectives, right, might you actively be seeking as you think about partnerships that you develop with other groups or individuals or volunteers that you might specifically seek out or encourage or try to build those relationships with people that are very different from you, which can feel really hard. And again, I know for myself, sometimes can even just be a question of, well, how do I even start? Do I even know the right people that might help me find the connections and the other people that I'm seeking to balance out my ecosystem? Felicia said, I think we can all tend to fill gaps, especially in a team. Often leaders are asked to be all of the roles at one point or another. Yeah, which can then sometimes be overwhelming or contribute to that overload. But if we had each role represented, it might allow each to be attended to more effectively without burning the more flexible people out. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think this is a different way to think about people's talents. As Nicole said, with implications for recruiting and team building and so forth, but also just that it's sometimes good for each of us individually or on a team to stretch into a different lane that we may not be as comfortable with, but it's also a way to elevate people who may have these strengths and talents and that they're not always looked at that way.
Mm-hmm. Kaki says we probably need them all in our network, not necessarily in one organization. Yep, which is certainly true. And so again, it can kind of stretch the thinking about who you consider your partners or who you consider people in your network or in your ecosystem. And Joy is just acknowledging often there's not the space to grow into new spaces. Certainly that can be true within established organizations. And so again, it might lead to a new line of thinking or questioning about, well, maybe not within my organization, but are there other avenues, other people and other movements, other networks I can tap into where I'd be able to be surrounded by people that are offering that balance.
And it may be that at different points in a social change movement or there's different urgency to these roles.
Mm-hmm. So I'd like to suggest before we start moving into our wrap up that that we continue using the chat box and ask you to share one step that you plan to take or that you would like to take to build or balance your social change ecosystem. So if this discussion today, if the exercise led you to think, oh, I'm going to push myself to be more of a fearless disruptor and try on that role, try on that hat, that'd be great. That's a great example. Or if you're realizing I need more storytellers in my ecosystem, especially older adults, or I don't see any weavers on my map and we need them more now than ever. So I'm going to start weaving myself and finding them. So any insights or thoughts about one action step that you could take as a result of doing this exercise and participating in this discussion today? We'd love to hear them.
And again, we're thinking of the social change ecosystem pretty broadly. So not just your team or your immediate group at whatever work you do, or could be a volunteer effort, grassroots thing you're involved in, or all of the above.
Robin is sharing that this could be a helpful lens to use with teams. Again, however you identify your team, to identify, acknowledge, and work with roles, similar to how organizations often use something like the Myers-Briggs framework or other kinds of, styles and personality questionnaires. Kaki's saying to really map her network fully, starting to fill the gaps, try new hats for herself. Yeah. Using the map, Najib says, using the map to see if we have the right people at the table. Joyce saying, continue to own and grow into my role as a disruptor. Nice. Felicia is sharing, seeking mentorship and connection with people that are thriving in roles that she doesn't naturally gravitate to. Yep. Catherine, interesting, trying on the role of frontline responder. It was one of the least identified with and likely one of the most important. Yeah, especially now with COVID. And Susan saying, making sure that we actually get a chance to understand how others see themselves and their strengths and their challenges too. Yeah. So not only identifying what roles we identify with or kind of, making assumptions about what roles other people play, but really asking and making that part of the relationship building. Gabby saying, learn where my growing edges are and push myself on those, step back from my traditional roles. Nice. Yeah, so a lot of similarities there and a lot of good, I think, reflections about how to take a tool like this and make it your own and to use the information in a way that feels most relevant and useful for you. Okay, Nicole.
Okay, thanks everyone. Well, it was nice to have a little bit of extra time. I know some people had to leave right at 11, but thank you for those of you who could stay and participate in that last part. We are hoping to have these conversations on an ongoing basis. So if you're new to them, welcome and welcome back soon. And to those of you who've been joining all along, we appreciate the fact that this is an arc and that we can keep talking here and in other circles as well. So with that being said, we do take your feedback seriously. As you know, that's a great fodder for us to come up with topics and tools and ideas to share. So please let us know your feedback on the survey link here that Nicole also put into the chat box. And then next week, we will have another equity-related discussion about digital equity and distance learning resources, and that will be with the Santa Cruz County Office of Education, and we'll have a Spanish translation option as well. So please share that topic if that's something that would be of interest in your own networks, and keep thinking about your map and how to balance it. And thank you all for being with us today, and hope we'll see you next week or soon.